Hello, book lovers! I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Check This Out is a series where I interview emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and the PenFaulkner Foundation. PenFaulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the PenFaulkner Award for Fiction. We have a lot of exciting books and authors coming your way this spring. Next week, I talk to Colwell Brown about her brand new debut, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. Tune in next week for that interview. Today on our show, my guest is Samir Pandya, and we are discussing his brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. Our Beautiful Boys is set in contemporary Southern California. The setup? 3 high school football players go to a party after a big win. At the party, a drug dealer mouths off and lunges at one of the boys. Together, the 3 football players fight him off. They're not gentle, but the drug dealer seems fine when they leave him. Later that night, the drug dealer emerges in much, much worse shape, and he blames the 3 boys for the beatdown that lands him in the hospital fighting for his life. The boys are suspended. The police might be coming. The boys pledge silence and loyalty to one another, but can they keep that promise? Soon the parents are involved. Tension explodes. What I love about this book is the way the author, Samir Pandya, doesn't just leave us with the boys. He dives deep, deep into the parents' lives, too. He shows us that no family is what they seem, that secrets are everywhere, and he shows angles that I never would have imagined. Our Beautiful Boys isn't just about who did it or what actually happened. It's about family dynamics. It's about boys on the edge who aren't quite men, who actually still need their parents, and parents who are burnt out and treading water themselves, just trying to get their kids through. Samir, I am thrilled to have you on my show today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Rachel, thank you so much. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it.
Samir Pandya, your new novel, Our Beautiful Boys, isn't quite a sports novel. It's not quite a novel about parents either, or parents dealing with kids. It's a complete mix. So when people ask you, what is your book about? What do you say?
Our Beautiful Boys is a portrait of 3 high school football players, their families, the Shastris, the Cruzes, and the Berringers, in a moment of violence that will drastically change all of their lives. I'm a huge fan of mashups, right? And I'm a huge fan of, in some ways, all of these genres that I love. And so one of the ways that I've tried to describe it is that it is a mashup of A Passage to India, A Separate Piece, and Friday Night Lights. And kind of these 3 books that have been really, really important to me. And I tried to kind of think of them together, right? A sports novel on one hand, which is, a tradition that I have always loved. And the sports novel is a kind of a critique of sports and what we do. But, what you particularly emphasized in your introduction is I love novels about families. And the family dynamic is something that is really, really important to me. And so I tried to kind of bring both of those together.
That's a good summary. Except all the good stuff we're going to talk about in just a minute. Could you read a passage so we can hear your voice?
I'm going to read just the 2 very, very brief sections that begins the novel. Except for the native caves, tucked high in the hills above town, the city of Charlesworth presents nothing extraordinary. During the day, the 3 large, craggly black holes set against a lime yellow hillside were something: a historical artifact, a geological occurrence, a living thing, an astonishing view. By dusk, they were mostly abandoned, the dirt path leading to them framed by cactus, sage, and the occasional beer can left by generations of teens looking for a secret place. And at night, the caves had a register and intensity of darkness that made it hard to tell up from down, side from side, boy from boy. Late one night, that darkness would pull all 4 boys into the largest cave, their arms and legs soon flailing and tangled, the click-click of their bones set against bone, their grunts and cries echoing off the smooth walls.
The bones, the sound of the bones echoing on the caves that echo through the entire book. Samir Pandya, thanks for reading the opening of your beautiful new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. Why this book? Why now?
In a certain way, I am interested in the lives of the three teenage boys at the center of this book, right? And I started writing this book first during the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, and I think in a certain way, I didn't realize that when it would be published, the conversation around boys and boys trying to become adults would be such an important kind of cultural and political topic. And that is the kind of origins of it, and the larger idea that I've been trying to work through in this book. And at a certain level, this kind of larger conversation is uh, kind of where we're at in terms of thinking through what's happening with these young men.
And why football? Are you a football player?
I am not a football player. I have so much trouble with the game, but alas, I also love watching it. The kind of fun of the book, right, for me, or the idea that I was trying to work through is that the Indian American family are so deeply kind of influenced by Gandhi and nonviolence. And I was trying to think of the one American sport that is as possibly un-Gandhian as possible. And football, alas, it is it.
I love that you brought up Gandhi here because one of your main characters talks a lot about a photograph. Explain the picture that's in the book for us.
The picture, my maternal grandfather was a portrait photographer in Mumbai in the 1940s and 50s. I never met him. He died before I was born. At one point, my mother brought these photographs back that he had taken. And one of them is this photograph. It is a photograph of Gandhi sometime perhaps in the 1930s. In my mind, I think it's a salt march in the early 1930s. It's a photograph that my grandfather took of Gandhi that I essentially make as the heirloom of one of the families in this novel.
And so, inspired you about this photograph? Why has this stuck with you and why did you put it in this book?
Gandhi, as this kind of idea in this book, has been kind of circling around in my mind, right? And there's something, in a way, the photograph plays the same role in the Shastri's family that, for example, putting up a cross or putting up some kind of article of faith is in other families, right? And so, in a way, this picture of Gandhi within this family is a reminder of how to live one's life, how to be humble, how to kind of not spend too much money, how to not self-aggrandize. And so it is the kind of this thing that haunts this family. And it's the thing that this particular character, the teenage boy Vikram, is trying to kind of run away from.
And so he goes to football, which could not be further from Gandhi.
Which, in a certain way, when you're a teenage boy, you want to do the thing that your parents tell you not to do, right? And so his parents are concerned about him playing football, and it is exactly what he turns himself into.
So this isn't based on your real life experience of turning to football.
Absolutely not. I arrived in this country when I was 8 years old and I picked up tennis. So I have no interest I'd never played the game. I love watching it. I go to my kids' high school football games, but it just seems, when you pick a sport as at a center of a book, you got to figure out the one that has good metaphor. And I think football, more than any other sport for me right now, has incredible metaphor about violence and nonviolence, about kind of what we ask our boys to do on the field of play.
So these three boys that we keep talking about, I want to slowly dip into them. In the book, you call them a laminated poster for the public school. These three boys are academically strong, they're athletically nimble, they're racially diverse, they are quite a group. Introduce us to the three boys briefly.
Yeah, so the three boys, two of them are juniors in high school. Vikram Shastri, he's from an Indian American family. The second one is Diego Cruz, who's also a junior, who lives with his mother, Veronica Cruz, who is a historian of Latin America at UCLA. And the third one is a boy named MJ Barringer, who is kind of the son of a pretty well-off, wealthy white American family. And the one thing I want to say about MJ as this novel begins, he's decided that he wants to unburden himself, as the narrator says, of the thingness of things. And so he just walks around without his shoes on.
So these three boys are really the starting point for the novel. And what was your inspiration for these three characters?
You know, I have teenage boys. For the last several years, I have been driving them around. I've been driving their friends around. I've been listening to what they say to each other. I've been listening to how the phones have shaped their lives. I've been listening to, in some ways, how they're intimate and how they're not intimate in terms of kind of the affection that they feel for their friends. And so all of that I was interested in. And it also, alas, allowed me to think about my own adolescent life, right? Which is, come on, all of us have really complicated adolescent lives. And it allowed me to do both, right? It allowed me to understand this group of teenagers as they are kind of coming up in the world. And it also allowed me to think about myself at 15, 16, 17, when I was trying to figure out what it meant to be in high school, what it meant to be a young man, what it meant to kind of go off to college and figure out who I wanted to be.
So I loved these boys. I thought they were really compelling, interesting, but I really loved the parents because I felt like you captured this truth, at least that I live, of getting your kids to the point where they look like adults, where they're just on that edge. It like takes all of a parent's energy, right? And by the time your kids are there and they get into trouble, you're just like, what? What? How do I deal with this? And you just capture that so well.
I love that liminal place, right? Which is they're driving around, they are making their own food. They look like, physically, they look like adults, right? But emotionally, of course, that they are not. And I think, we always talk about, this kind of emotional uh, maturation of boys versus girls, right? And how much ahead the girls are. And so that lack of maturation is what I was particularly interested in, and kind of, in essence, placing them in this kind of inciting incident of this terrible thing that they do in a cave and how they react to it.
Samir, can you read this one paragraph that you wrote that introduces us to this mental state, to the parents, to one parent in particular, Veronica Cruz? Because I just felt like this passage where we see her really sets up how we're going to see the parents in this book.
Yeah. Tucked between an email that offered 20% off skin treatments at a spa in town and a note about her healthcare benefits was one with the subject line, urgent. She read it once and then twice. Her immediate reaction was not to wonder what had happened and how it might affect Diego. Instead, she'd have to cancel her trip, or at the very least postpone leaving this morning. Her talk was scheduled for 5 p.m. She could take a later flight. Trips like this were important to her. She liked the fringe benefits, the business class tickets she insisted the host purchase, the nice hotels, the fancy meals. But what she liked the most was that she was an authority on a subject, and for this particular genre of invitation, her host seldom questioned this fact. Over the years, she had read and read and written, the completion of each book creating in her an unshakable exhaustion. In exchange, the universe had been professionally kind, and yet she had never compromised in the attention she paid in raising Diego on her own. She never said no to a reasonable request from him. She never said she was too busy with work. But when work was finally scheduled, she saw it as her sacred, untouchable time.
I love that setup because you show us right there the boys are in trouble. She gets a note from the principal saying, "You need to come see me. Diego's suspended." And her first thought is, "But I have a trip." Right? And I'm dealing with this kid on my own. Talk to us about this moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think partly what I want to begin by saying was I began writing this novel primarily interested in the parents, right? And parents at this kind of exhausting moment in their lives of dealing with their careers, dealing with their own ambitions, and wanting to be there for their children and wanting to be present for them, right? And I think, as we all know, you can't do all of those things at the same time if you are expecting yourself to do well at it, right? And so, this particular moment, Veronica is a single mom and she is doing this all on her own. She is incredibly successful and has kind of portioned off this time for herself. And I was really in that moment trying to figure out, when is it okay for a parent to be selfish? When is it okay for a parent to say, hey, I have done all of this, but this is my moment. This is my time. I want you to respect it. Now, of course, the problem with parenting is it doesn't quite respect your schedule. right? It doesn't respect the things that you want. And that's what I was really trying to work through here.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Samir Pandya, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about the brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys, which is about three boys. Of course, they're three football players, and they are accused of beating up another kid, a drug dealer. He's a bully. He comes down from a cave, beaten up much worse than they thought they had beaten him up, and he ends up in the hospital. But really, what this novel comes to focus on is the theme of parenting and parents. And Samir, we were just talking about this idea. You give us the moment the parents are contacted and how they react and what it means to them when their kids are suspended and they're implicated in this big, big fight, this problem, this beaten up boy. So let's talk about the layers of the parents. How did you choose the parents that you chose to depict?
In a way, the three parents are, one's an Indian American family, another's a white family, and one's a Latino family. And I didn't sit down and say I need to figure out these three different kind of racially diverse families, right? That in my head, I had moments that arrived with each of these families, right? Gautam and Geeta, who are in mid-marriage and having trouble with their marriage. And I was interested in kind of that particular moment. The image that first came to me was the wife, Geeta, at one point in a fit of understandable anger, tearing down the cupboards in her kitchen because they're so old and dirty, and her husband refuses to help her exchange them or get them fixed. With Veronica Cruz, I pictured this beautiful craftsman house that she lives in. And then with the Berringers, I pictured this kind of living room that they have, right, where they host their guests. And so in some ways, I arrived at these three families through the particular details of their lives that I was interested in. And I went from there. You start with that very specific, Rachel, and then you kind of build out, you build out, you build out until you have the characters and the families that are on the page.
So as I was reading, I actually kept a chart, a sort of family chart for each one so that I could keep track of them as I was going. And I was just so taken aback and impressed by how well you detailed each of those three families because they're so different. I think it's easy to look at families and think, oh, well, everyone's struggling to, figure out how to get their kids into college or whatever. But actually, each family has a very different detail or issue that they're trying to work through under that surface. So how did you come to those stories for each of the families?
I mean, in a way, the idea was, on one level, and this is what we're all trying to do when we're writing about families, right? Which is, how are they the same and how are they different, right? And kind of how do you kind of work both of those at the same time? What I really wanted to do with these three families is for them to have their own conflicts, so that the moment in the cave with the teenage boys in some ways brings to boil conflicts that already exist in their lives. For the Shastris, it is their marriage and kind of Gautam, who's having trouble at work. For Veronica, it is this kind of mysterious envelope that appears in her mailbox, which kind of becomes its own mystery. And for the Berringers, it's Michael Berringer, who's been basically pretending to go to work when, in fact, his work is completely dried up. And so the idea there was to create their own crises and then this bigger crisis to kind of layer on top of it. And so that's how I kind of began to think of them and piece them together, which is what's going on in their own lives, right? And I would kind of move on from there.
And the diversity of these three families and their backgrounds, or the three kids, how did you come to make them so diverse?
I am first and foremost interested in the American family. And in some ways, there's no better way to get to the heartbeat of the American family than to have these three very different types of families, to see how they react and don't react to the same moment, right? And so, what I was particularly interested in, and this has kind of been a fairly consistent idea that I have, or something that I've been thinking through, is brownness, right? And what the Shastris and the Cruzes allowed me to do was to understand the two sides of the same kind of brown coin, so to speak, right? Which is how they experience their lives, right? And I think this is this consistent conversation that Geeta Shastri has with Veronica Cruz, where Geeta says, you know, her son is not going to get protected in the same way that Diego is. And Diego's mother says, your son is not going to have the same issues when they enter a room, right? And so, in the context of all this, I wanted this kind of white American kid who has had all of these privileges and is now beginning to be really uncomfortable with those privileges, right? So there is kind of all of those pieces kind of work together. And of course, standing over all of this is Helen Mitchell, who's the African American principal, who's sitting there watching all of this go down, right? All this kind of racial performance go down. And she has seen all of this before and is trying her best to be patient with it.
And you also, of course, tie in with all of that sort of diversity. You have class diversity and educational diversity. You make it clear that most of these characters are highly, highly educated. And class is right there in the middle of all of it.
I was really kind of interested in this, right? Which is, so often we tend to associate class with races, right? And we live in a moment where I think writers have really deconstructed this in really incredible ways. And so the idea I had with these three families was they're all well off. They're all upper middle class. They're not struggling to get to college, right? And in fact, the character who is the least well off, whose family is the least well off in the story, is Stanley Kincaid, who is the high school classmate who kind of deals in bits of drugs here and there.
Just to be clear, he's the kid who gets beaten up.
Exactly. And so I want to invert the kinds of traditional understandings that we have of how race and class operates, because I think in pockets of our American lives, this is how these lives are lived. And as a novelist, I want to try to kind of find these places that mess with the kinds of narratives that we have come to understand, right? Like that's in some ways what I feel is a part of my job when I try to write whatever 390 pages, which is these are the stories you think you have in your head. Let me offer you a different set of stories.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Samir Pandya, and we are talking about his brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. This novel is about three football players, teammates, who beat up another kid, Stanley, and they leave him in a cave. And they think he's not in such bad shape, but about an hour later, he comes back down from this cave, and he's in horrible shape, and he ends up in the hospital. And from there, we're left with a sort of whodunit, what happened to this kid who really beat him up, because the three boys all swear that they didn't do it. And this brings in the families, and this also brings in this big theme of secrets and friendship. And we have these three boys, the football players, who swear to one another that they're not going to tell, they're not going to break and say what really happened. But they're teammates. That's their link. One of them in particular is sort of a new teammate. So can you tell us, Samir, about this bond between the three boys?
You know, there's a way in which when you're a teenage boy and you become friends, that friendship goes from 0 to 60 very, very quickly, where you suddenly feel you are really, really good friends with this person, especially when it's in the context of sports, which kind of really breeds this idea of a friendship, right? And of being teammates. And so, what I'm trying to kind of figure out in this book is when you have that intensity of emotion, what happens when you need to save yourself, right? How do you balance out the desire to be a part of a group versus your own self-interest for the kinds of things that you've worked hard for that, you don't want your parents mad at you, right? And so this in some ways becomes part of their secret keeping is to maintain both of these things at the same time, these friendships that they have, but then their individual lives at the same time.
And one of the things that was so well captured in this novel is they think that they're keeping this secret at first, what happened in the cave. And on the surface, it's not that bad, right? Stanley, the drug dealer bully, was bullying them. He swung at them and they took a few swings. That's the story. And there's this question of, do you really need to keep that secret? And I can imagine these kids, right? 16, 17-year-old kids are like, well, of course we keep that secret. And then you show the parents who are saying, but that's no big deal. Just tell us, right? Just tell us. Can you talk about that tension?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the cover up is always worse than the lie, right? What happens is, they leave Stanley Then when he kind of comes down off the cave, he is in much worse shape than he was before, right? So the implication that the novel is making is who went back up, right? Which is this is not how we left him. And so there is in some ways this fear that the kids have, right? Which is, how do you balance out the fear that you're the only one who's going to get in trouble, right? Because Vikram is new to this friendship, I think what his overriding fear is MJ and Diego were really nice to him when he succeeded on the field, but they will sell him out as quickly as possible. Diego and his friends say, hey, look, you're a different kind of brown than Vikram is. These other folks are going to sell you out as quickly as possible, right? And MJ is just sitting there without his shoes on, trying to figure out like why he's going to not go to Yale when it's time for him to go to Yale the following year. And so that's that kind of thing where I think the parents, as they're looking from the outside, they're just saying, please just tell us, let us fix this. Let's get this boy healthy and let's move on, right? I think the 17-year-old brain simply feels things much more intensely.
You've touched just for a minute on how these three boys are friends, they're teammates, that they will do anything on the field for one another. But at the same time, you take us into their practices and you let us hear the way they talk to each other. And their teammates say some horrible things. They have some nicknames for one another that maybe are not appropriate. Can you talk about that and sort of the sports talk side of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think these boys, not just on the sports field, in any walk of life, right? The way in which they are talking to each other, it's almost as if they are testing out boundaries. They're testing out their own boundaries. And when they get onto the field, it's almost like this social space where you can say anything, right? Because in a certain way, once you start playing, you are being taught to knock each other out. That is, in essence, what football is teaching you. It puts on helmets and pads and the rules of the game, but at its heart beating core, the game is knock the other dude out, right? And so the idea here is if that is the rule of the game, then what rules count when you're on the field? And I think in them being this, potty mouthed is, I think, the lightest way of saying what they are saying to one another, right? It's much, much worse than that. And as a writer, I just kind of wanted to let myself hear them talk, right? And see what it looks like. And I think at one point, MJ says to Vikram, it's like, hey, don't worry about all this stuff that they're saying to you. Once you start performing well, they'll forget all about it. And Vikram's thinking, I got to perform well to not be called Bin Laden by these guys over and over again. That's what I'm trying to explore.
And it feels very real. My guest today is Samir Pandya. We're talking about his brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. So, in your book, Our Beautiful Boys, you're really exploring this theme of lies or truth. What is the truth? Because the principal, the parents, they all want to hear what is the truth of what happened in that cave to Stanley. But at the same time, one of the biggest lies, secrets, untruths, whatever you want to call it in this book, is really around the character Veronica Cruz, who is Diego's mom. He's one of the football players who was busted. And it turns out that she was actually born Veronica Matthews. And so the question comes in, what is her background? Does she actually have Brazilian, Portuguese heritage? Is she white? Who is she? And who has she been telling the world she is? Could you read for us and tell us about her?
Okay. When I applied to graduate school, this time with my married name, Veronica Cruz, and with this new project, things were suddenly much better for me. I didn't lie about my name on the applications. It was my new legal name. My transcripts, my letters of rec, all had my old name. I wasn't pretending to be someone I wasn't. But when I arrived, my cohort assumed I was Latina. The faculty I took classes with all seemed excited to work with me. It was a brand new feeling, and I really liked it. And so it just stuck. It wasn't that I was introducing myself in a particular way. It was just that people made their assumptions and I didn't correct them. I became Brazilian, Chicana, Latina, whatever they thought I was. And then eventually my books started coming out. My Portuguese is impeccable, as is my Spanish. That can take you a long way. But let me be clear. I did all that work myself. I was the one who spent the time in the archives. I was the one who wrote each of these books. And I know that I haven't been the friendliest presence in the department, but I've only asked for the things I deserved. You, of all people, know what I mean.
Wow, this just blew me away because we have the parents demanding the truth from their children. And then we have Veronica Cruz, who grew up as Veronica Matthews, who has a perfectly blonde brother, clearly white brother, she is white, living a life based on what people assume because of her name, Veronica Cruz. Tell me about this character and this predicament.
Listen, I love all of these characters, right? And loving them means recognizing their deep faults, the ways in which they lie to themselves and they lie to one another. And so, what I'm interested in, Veronica, is the section that I just read to you, right? What she says is she takes responsibility for having done what she has done, right? Which is assuming an identity that she suggests when she was in graduate school helped her be more successful. But what she's also taking to task are the people that were also invested in her being Veronica Cruz, that celebrated her being Veronica Cruz. And so I was interested in this idea, right, of what performance means. And, you know, for the entire novel, Veronica has been defending her son and saying to Gita Shastri, you have no idea what the experience of having the last name Cruz is like for my son, right? Which is absolutely true. Diego has a, a Chicano father, right, who lives in Texas. But when you get to the end of the book, what you realize is she's been saying all this, it's been truthful, but of course, she's been lying about herself, right? It doesn't make what she says about Diego any less true. But how do you now feel about Veronica that by this time, by page 340, Rachel, I hope you, one, has come to appreciate what she is trying to do, what she's trying to balance. And what I was really interested in is what happens when you suddenly have an issue with a character perhaps that you've come to like.
Right, because she's a single mom, and she has worked very, very hard to get where she is. She's at the pinnacle of her academic career. She's being invited all over the place. She's done fantastic work, and yet it's under the name Veronica Cruz. And suddenly everything is called into question. And we really have this perfect setup for descriptive versus substantive representation. And it's just incredible.
I think the related thing I wanted to explore in this is what she is asking is it's not that she is not Portuguese, right? Way back when her family is from Portugal, right? And so, in a way, one of the things that I was thinking about is the Shastris identify themselves in relationship to Gandhi and this photograph, right? This one particular kind of ethnic part of who they are, right? Which is how is that different or how is that similar to the kind of performance that Veronica herself has been engaged in, right? And that's what I was trying to explore with her, right? Like I am trained as an academic, and so all of my interests in history and kind of the funnest thing in some ways one of the funnest things for me in this book was to give her a scholarly bibliography, right? To think through what books she's written and why she is famous. The novel begins with her reading the review of her own book in the New York Review of Books. And she's kind of arrived at this moment. She's sitting under her favorite oak tree reading it, right? And I feel great affection for her, even as I recognize her faults.
I mean, I have been obsessed with this character and this question. For the last few days, everybody I have spoken to, I introduce to Veronica Cruz, nay, Veronica Matthews. And I say, what do you think? If people assume that she's one thing as Veronica Cruz, right? And they put her on diversity committees and they ask for her opinion on South American literature, Central American literature based on Veronica Cruz. And even though on all of her transcripts, everything, it says Veronica Matthews, is she lying? And the array of responses was stunning. I couldn't believe how differently people felt. Have people felt differently with you? Like, are they expressing these opinions with you too?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, when she finally has a conversation with her son, the son says, wait, you've been getting so angry at me for this past week for lying. And you have been doing this all throughout, right? And, I think you're totally right, right? Like the reactions that I've gotten from people are exactly right. It's an entire variation of kind of how to feel about her, right? And there's a moment when she's talking to her son about it finally, when she says, "Look, I was newly single." She makes an economic decision. She said, "I go down the Veronica Cruz road, right, in the proverbial fork in the road. I do well. I get jobs. I get tenure. I get to give you a house where there is food and comfort. I take the Veronica Matthews route, and I have no idea where that route is going." And so logically, perhaps not ethically, logically, it was the only choice for her to make, right? And now, of course, she has to live with it. I kind of leave open what that next moment is going to look like. And I think socially, Rachel, to your point, all these people reacting to it in different ways, we are socially trying to figure out what to do with the Veronica Cruzes of the world, right? Do we owe her our forgiveness? Do we owe her our kind of anger? I don't know. I think I both am angry and forgiving of her at the same time.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Samir Pandya, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about the brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. This book on the surface is about three boys, three teammates. They're football players, and they beat up another kid who is a sort of bully, drug dealer. His name is Stanley. They leave Stanley in this cave, and an hour later, he comes down in much worse shape than he was originally in. And the question is, what happened to him? And then you bring in social media because we're in a high school, we're in America, contemporary Southern California. And you bring up these two sides. They're sort of the we believe you, Stanley, and the Stanley lies side. So can you talk about that and how their peers step into this fight?
So I needed Charlesworth High School to be a character in this novel because I think if you're familiar with contemporary high school life, you know that it is a profoundly intense social scene. So the fight occurs on a Friday night. The Tuesday after, these banners appear in the main hallway. On one side of the banner, it says Stanley lies, and on the other side of the banners, we believe you, Stanley. So the idea is that the school is splitting apart. And what I am really amazed by social media is how much truth and lies are refracted through Snapchat and Instagram and all of these other sites or these kind of apps that these young high schoolers use. And particularly what's going to become important is who's taking videos, right? And I think I see this all the time, and you see this all the time. The second something occurs, it's like this new reaction we all have as the phones just go up. Like there is, in some ways, there is no part of our lives anymore that are not somehow recorded. And I think that's what I was trying to figure out. Now, the issue here, and this is why, for me, it was fun to set the inciting incident of this novel in a cave, which is dark and it echoes. It's the one space in our lives where, in some ways, there's no perfect video and no perfect audio. It's too dark, and the things we say come back to us in an echo. And that's what I was trying to kind of balance out here.
So you actually set this up in the book. Can you read a quick paragraph?
Yeah. By Tuesday morning, word of the events on Friday night had spread to the entire school. There wasn't a single student who hadn't heard some version of the story. The school newspaper, which had a deadline on Friday afternoon to put the monthly print issue to bed, had moved the existing main story below the fold and replaced it with a massive headline. What happened in the cave? There was no accompanying article.
This passage is so powerful, especially on the heels of what you just said about phones and the fact that, teenagers, kids, all of us, just the phones go up when something's happening. But in this cave, there were no phones. So what happened? And it's sort of an existential, did it happen if you didn't have a phone?
A part of what this book is trying to work through is on the phone, what is truth and what is not? The things that you think you trust when you see it, that you begin to question, right? And I think, is there a space of truth that is outside of the things that we have recorded, that we have seen? And I think maybe the space of that truth is people talking to one another. these characters, these families trying to work all of this out so that they can collectively save themselves and collectively save their futures.
But you also point out that even if you have something on a video, it doesn't necessarily tell the story because in one of the videos that was caught, we see one of the three boys coming down behind Stanley, right? And the question is, was he in the cave? Did he just happen to be there when you took the video? Right? So even if you have a video, you still don't know the truth.
I think you can take it and spin it in all sorts of different ways, right? Like that is, I think, a part of the point that ultimately maybe the semblance of truth that we can get to is if we can collect the 15 different videos, right? And this is ridiculous, right? Like we've become like an NCIS episode. Like we are just trying to kind of piece together all of this digital evidence. I think in a way, we would like to think that all of this video makes things easier. And I'm beginning to wonder, and what this novel is wondering, is if it's actually not making it that much easier. In fact, you can say, well, you have this video, I got another one. You have this photo, I have another one. If we're constantly taking these photos, we're constantly able to create different kinds of narratives.
Samir Pandya, your new novel, Our Beautiful Boys, certainly focuses on the boys, these videos, what happened in the cave. But again, what really drew me in, what kept me reading, were the parents. That you capture these parents in the moment where they have boys, their three children who are just about to become grown-ups. They're right in that liminal space on the edge, and they're asking themselves about their own marriages. Because not only do, the kids grow up and move out, but a marriage changes in that moment when a child moves out or goes on to school, whatever it is that they do when they turn 18. Talk about that theme of marriage and changing marriage in your novel.
I think what I am interested in is not the beginning of a relationship and perhaps not the end of a relationship, but how one sustains the middle part of a relationship. Veronica is single, but both the Berengers and the Shastris are in the midst of crisis. And part of the crisis is that they have defined themselves as parents. In this particular case, the two of them have gotten married. They did not have children, then they had children. And there is almost this kind of melancholy that both sets of parents are experiencing, right? In some ways, the phrase "our beautiful boys" is from the point of view of the parents. It's a kind of a melancholy point of view, recognizing that they're going to lose them, that all of their kids are beginning to leave. At one point, Shirley Berenger looks at a photograph. There's a photograph on her wall of herself and her husband, Michael, when they were in the Peace Corps in Uganda. And she looks at this photo and she can't recognize who this couple was, that, who they were before they became who they have become. And so, in some ways, what this novel is seeing, right, the coming of age is, of course, for the teenage boys, but these marriages are coming of age, right? Which is, what is this new moment going to look like? And it's that new transitional moment that everyone is experiencing that I'm interested in with these two marriages.
And then we have one of my favorite scenes where Geeta just destroys the cabinets in the kitchen. That great metaphor.
The very quick backstory is that she's been wanting to redo her kitchen, and her husband Gautam, who's been struggling with work, keeps saying, I can just slap some paint on, right? And she thinks in her mind, she hated the use of the verb slap. And like, he doesn't know how to do it. She wishes her husband was much more handy. And at one point, when she's trying to hold everything together, where the two men in her lives, her 17-year-old son and her husband, are just being dunces, right? Are just being thick in managing their lives. She just finally has it. And she's like, I'm not going to wait anymore. And so one night they've come back from a party and she just takes a crowbar and starts ripping him apart, right? And I think in some ways, that is one of the initial images that I had of this novel, which is, what does it look when you finally are like, enough? I'm not doing this anymore. And without a sense of how she's going to replace them, she just like tears them apart and she just sits there. It's like, yeah, I tore it apart. You guys are tearing yourselves apart, right? And she says, you know, when do I get to be sick of everyone in the way everyone seems to be sick of me? And I think when she says that, she's like, I've had enough. Like, I call uncle on all of this.
My guest today is Samir Pandya. We're talking about his brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Samir, I understand that your road to becoming an author has taken many twists and turns, and you had a big realization when you were teaching Heart of Darkness, and that's where you took one of your biggest turns. Can you tell us about that?
Wow, that's deep from the archives, Rachel. So I trained as a literary critic. And as I said, I came to this country when I was 8 with my family. And when I graduated from college, I wanted to be a short story writer. And I couldn't sell that particular narrative to my parents. And what I realized much later in my life was my parents would have let me do that. They would have been like, fine, give it a shot, right? I think I was just simply too scared at 22 to become a short story writer. I got a PhD in literature. I went off for my first job. And in the midst of maybe my second or third year of teaching, I was teaching once again A Heart of Darkness, Conrad's novella that I absolutely love. And at the end, I'm trying to explain to these students why Kurt at the end says the horror, the horror. And what I realized was I couldn't teach this novel again and again for the rest of my professional career. I'd been wanting to be a fiction writer. I'd put it off for 5 years, for 10 years. And I had this very good job, which, I think of as a pre-recession decision. I quit and said, I'm going to become a writer, which, in some ways I can say now with a certain amount of ease, having become a writer. But, thinking back on it just seems like an absolutely foolish decision. And then, over these years, I published a book of stories, I published a novel, and now my second novel. And so that moment with Conrad has always been really, really important to me.
As has the immigrant novel, right? But not the straight up immigrant novel. Can you talk about that?
The sandbox that I have played in, and I want to play in because it is important to me, is the lives of Indian immigrants to America. These are the lives that I know. It is who I am. It is who my family is. It's who my extended family is. So I've been trying to kind of think through all of this. And, in the classroom, I teach about the immigrant novel, but what being an immigrant looks like is changing dramatically, right? And particularly with the immigrants in this novel, the Gautam who was born in India, and his son Vikram, right? I'm trying to work through these very different experiences of what it means for them to live in America. And so I'm always trying to write the immigrant novel and deconstruct it at the same time. And by deconstructing is showing what the variety of these lives look like.
You still teach at a university. You see lots of students, I'm assuming, who want to become writers, want to publish their fiction. What advice do you give them?
The first piece of advice I give them in relationship to writing is please, please get comfortable with rejection. Because if you're not comfortable with rejection, this is going to be a really, really difficult road. I want to be clear about that. If you're not getting rejected, then, bless you. And I'm really, really happy for you. Most writers I know and the experiences I've had is I've had so many more no's than yeses. And so that is the first thing I say to them.
Samir Pandya, thank you so much for joining me today here on Check This Out.
Rachel, I really appreciate this. And I really appreciate our conversation. It's been wonderful.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. You've been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn-Faulkner Foundation. Penn-Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the Penn-Faulkner Award for Fiction. I'll be back next week with Caldwell Brown and her new novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. And if you want to catch me live and in person, join me for a joint fundraiser with 826 Boston and Check This Out. I'll be on stage with Marjan Kamali on May 14th at 6 p.m. at Grub Street in Boston's Seaport District. Join me. Our producer is Jessica Hunt. Penn-Faulkner's executive director is Gwydion Sullivan. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by CNS Wholesale Grocers Family of Companies, the podcast Totally Booked with Zibby, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Remember to go to your local library or local bookstore and check out all the books you hear about here and love. Thanks for listening. See you next time.